Star Wars and international affairs have always had an interesting relationship in terms of inspiration. Mostly the relationship has been IA influencing Star Wars writers and story creators. Sometimes the inspiration is direct, such as the original trilogy and the Outbound Flight novel, but also sometimes Star Wars content that comes out and at times is oddly similar to the international situation without any official inspiration towards the author or creator. In this video, I'll look at some Star Wars media and its international affairs, inspirations, and influences, as well as other things that were happening in the world at the time of each piece of media being published or having been written. There are also elements of Star Wars and other sci-fi media that have been an inspiration for military technology, but that's not what this video is about, and sci-fi media equipment being adapted by militaries would have to be its own video. Just as a disclaimer, not every piece of Star Wars content was directly inspired by what I'm relating it to, and I'm not trying to state an author's intent or views on any specific conflict. I'm not claiming that there's a direct connection between some global conflicts and Star Wars media that was released around the same time, but rather pointing out some connections and, in other cases, some interesting coincidences, although some of that is the case between an author and a connection between the conflict. But with that, on to the video and 7 case studies that I've chosen to summarize and relate. The original trilogy was heavily inspired by the war in Vietnam. That's a pretty commonly known connection between Star Wars and international affairs. George Lucas had felt that the US actions in the Vietnam War, such as the covert bombing of Cambodia by Nixon, was what an empire would do. The look of the stormtroopers was also meant to show how faceless that he perceived the military in the 1970s might become as a result of the Vietnam War. A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back film producer Gary Kurtz was also a Marine combat cameraman during the Vietnam War as well. That's just something interesting that I thought I'd throw in here. Next up is the Thrawn campaign, which took place in Timothy Zahn's Thrawn Trilogy that was released from 1991 to 1993. Zahn was giving a relatively free hand in creating the character of Grand Admiral Thrawn, who he drew inspiration from many military figures. He created a character who he believed would be less evil or brutal than Palpatine and Vader. Anyway, Thrawn's story takes place after the Return of the Jedi, and in the Thrawn Trilogy, the Empire came back under Thrawn and threatened the New Republic's control over the galaxy. In the end, Thrawn was killed by his own bodyguard Rook. Turning to the IA standpoint, the 1991 to 1993 years saw 2 major events in international affairs: the disillusionment of the USSR and the Gulf War. The USSR imploded and the US won the Cold War officially in 1991. Gorbachev had essentially accepted the USSR's fate, but there were Soviet hardliners who tried to stage a coup in August of 91 before the disillusionment of the Union. However, the Russian military units deployed during the coup defected against the coup plotters. Another instance of violent political conflict in Russia was in 1993 during the parliamentary crisis, where President Yeltsin violently suppressed the opposition. In the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, and the coalition responded with Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. It was the first major conflict since World War II which saw mass tank battles and an international coalition deploy hundreds of thousands of troops. President George H.W. Bush called on the Iraqi military to overthrow Saddam, but this did not happen, and Saddam Hussein brutally put down the uprisings. Much like the fall of the USSR, Thrawn's empire fell from within, but unlike in the Gulf War, the uprisings against Thrawn by the Noghri species on the planet Honoghr were successful with New Republic support. The New Jedi Order books about the Yuzhang Vong War came out from 1999 to 2003 and witnessed the New Republic and Galactic Empire join forces against an alien invader from outside the known galaxy, and it took place over a decade after the end of the Galactic Civil War. Following the end of the Cold War, the US and Russia began to work together but weren't necessarily initially allies. Russo-American cooperation of the 1990s and 2000s was aimed at preventing democratic backsliding in Russia, and after the outbreak of the Second Chechen War and the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Russia and the US worked together in the early years of the War on Terror. Additionally, the New Jedi Order books and Russo-American cooperation lasted throughout 2003. Russo-American cooperation began to become hostile following the 2004 Fifth NATO enlargement. Meanwhile, the New Jedi Order books had seen the New Republic and Galactic Empire come together as one as the Galactic Alliance as a galaxy-wide government. But that was in 2003 and before Putin renewed hostilities in 2004 between the US and Russia. Another instance of Star Wars and IA is the Outbound Flight book by Timothy Zahn, written in 2006, and it revolves primarily around the neoconservative idea of a preemptive strike. In the book, Thrawn launched a preemptive strike against the Vegari, who were a brutal race of slavers, and he immediately was reprimanded by the Chiss, which was his species, for this strike. But he lets the results of defeating the Vegari without civilian casualties speak for itself. Meanwhile, the Iraq War was a preemptive strike against Saddam Hussein due to the faulty intelligence pointing to Saddam having WMDs. George W. Bush and his administration followed a policy of shoot first and let the results speak for themselves. By 2006, the Iraq War was highly polarized between its supporters and critics, and Bush primarily looked at the Iraq War as a war of giving democracy to Iraq. The Star Wars Darkhorse Republic comics about the Clone Wars in the early 2000s before the start of the 2008 show took a gritty tone to warfare. Dark Horse's Republic comics about the Clone Wars also came out during the early global war on terrorism from 2003 to 2006, showing stuff like the Battle of Jabim with lots of gritty violence, a battle on a moon of Naboo where swamp gas, which is similar to mustard gas, is deployed by the CIS against civilians, and the Battle of Hanover, which saw trihexylophene 1138, another WMD, being deployed by the Separatists. There's a lot of Dark Horse comics, not limited to the Republic series, that I could talk about, but some of the most combat and war-oriented series were released during the height of the global war on terrorism, when the people really feared terrorist attacks and non-state combatants getting their hands on and deploying weapons of mass destruction. The Legacy of the Force books came out from 2006 to 2008 and were about the start of a second galactic civil war. Jacen Solo became Darth Caedus and triggered a massive civil war between the Galactic Alliance and Confederation. Many factions switched sides between the Galactic Alliance to the Confederation, such as the Imperial Remnant and Jedi Coalition. In IA terms, the 2006 to 2008 period saw mass division politically within the US, internationally between Russia and NATO. Russian revisionism began in 2004, and Putin was hostile towards NATO for the following years, and the Georgian War of 2008 was Russia's message against NATO expansion. Within Iraq, as the 2006 to 2008 period was the civil war period of the Iraq War. The Iraqi Civil War saw massive ethnic violence and cleansing between Shia and Sunni Muslims, and ended with the surge of US troops and the Awakening Campaign of 2008. The Awakening Campaign had seen many former insurgents join the US coalition and turn on al-Qaeda in Iraq, and was very successful in combating terrorism in the country. Then there's the original concept for the Star Wars sequel trilogy, which was based somewhat on Operation Inherent Resolve and the war against ISIS. This trilogy would have had the New Republic fighting against Imperial remnants that were unable to be fully defeated as they remained in a low-level insurgency. The Imperials were to represent the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq becoming ISIS, against the New Republic being both the coalition and the Paper Tiger military forces of the Iraqi state, which in my opinion would have been a whole lot better than whatever the crap the writers of the actual sequel trilogy were smoking. There are many other examples of Star Wars and IA's relationship, such as the Dark Empire storylines from 1991 to 1995, Crimson Empire trilogy releasing in 1998, 1999, and 2012, many more individual Darkhorse comic stories, and then there's also a ton of examples throughout the 7 seasons of the fantastic show Star Wars The Clone Wars, which shows elements of World War II, the Cold War, many proxy wars, the global war on terrorism, Syrian civil war, and many more which I wrote about in my history thesis, but I won't get into that in this video. Do you like this kind of content? Write in the comments if you would like a part 2 about other Star Wars and IA examples, or if you'd want me to go further into detail about some of these case studies, and thank you for watching.